Okay.
Now the daf is daf mem vav, and we're trying to understand the pasuk of Ibadatem es Shmam. Amalor Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says that I don't need, as Rabbi Eliezer says, a pasuk to teach me that you have to be misharesh achreha. That means you have to uncover the buried avodah zarah in order to destroy them. That I can derive from a different pasuk, abi ta'abedu, the double language. In keimata malom v'ibadatem shmam minamokum lechanos lashem. We have to give a nickname to the idols. So the Gemara asks, Yochel l'shvach. Maybe you mean we have to give a very prominent and complimentary name. L'shvach sal kedaitach. What are you asking a stupid question for? The Torah rejects avodah zarah as being repulsive. Ella yochel lo l'shvach v'lo l'gnaim. Maybe the Torah is saying just change its name. And the purpose of the Torah was not to be derogatory towards the avodah zarah. That wasn't on the agenda, but rather the Torah wanted to just make sure that the idol worshippers should no longer identify with that idol. So therefore, just change its name. Talmud Lomar, but the Torah says, Shaketz shaktsenu v'sayv ta'avenu ki cherem hu. The Torah says that the avodah zarah is repulsive, it's loathsome, and therefore it must be that we have to find a very pejorative name for the avodah zarah. Okay, give me an example. The idol worshippers called it Beis Galia. Beis Galia means it's very high, up in the air. It's a heap of something very, very special. Koranosa Beis Karya. We'll call it the house of a ditch, meaning it's underground. Forget about it. It's unimportant. Or, for example, if they call the idol Ein Kol, it's the eye of everything, as if to say it dominates over the world. Ein Kotes, we call it the eye of a thorn. Tani kami sheish ha'ove kochavim ha'ovdim es ha'horim v'esagvos hein mutarim v'ovdeim b'sayif. And this we said in the previous daf, that although the Torah doesn't prohibit the mountains that were worshipped, but he who worships the mountain, let's say a goy, and idolatry is one of 7 mitzvahs they know for which the punishment is saif, he will get saif. V'es hazroim v'es hayirokos hein asurim v'ovdeim b'saif. However, by contrast, if we're talking about grains and herbage, they're also, they don't have the same status as the mountain. Of course, Ovdeim B'Saif, that goes without saying. But the chiddush is that the grains and the herbage itself becomes prohibited. And the answer is because yesterday we learned that if there's tfisas yad adam bo, meaning you need the human endeavor or hand in order to create something, that it's not like a mountain, and therefore comes under the law of the Isra Avodah Zarah. Now, in order to get herbage and in order to get grains, you have to have the human action to create those grains. They don't exist in nature. Amalei. So then, after this brisa was taught to Rav Sheshes had a comment to make. Not to reject this brisa, but rather to identify its author. The Omar Loch Mani. In other words, if you want to know who is the author of this brisa, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehudi. The Omar Elon Shenitola Basof Havaro also. You know, it's the reason why the brisa paskins that grains are prohibited. It's not because they were planted specifically for the sake of idol worship. They were planted as herbage, for food, or a cabbage. I don't know what. Mm-hmm. But later on, it was worshipped. Again, these concepts are so out of our orbit. I mean, the Gemara is going to talk about a case where he worships an egg. It's crazy. But be that as it may, even though it wasn't planted for the sake of Avodah Zarah, but rather for innocuous purposes, nevertheless, it becomes also later And that's Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda that we learned yesterday, that he holds that it doesn't matter what the original planting was. Let's say, I had a tree that was planted for secular purposes, mundane purposes. If later on it was worship, it becomes Avodah Zarah. Frek the Gemara, why does Rav Sheshes have to introduce Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda? Why don't we assume that this brisa is addressing a case of something that was initially planted for the purpose of Avodah Zarah? And the Rabbanan agreed to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, if the original planting was for the sake of Avodah Zarah, that it's awesome. Lo salkedaita. Why? Because when we read the brisa carefully, what we'll see is Katani Dumya Dahar. In one breath, the brisa brings two cases, the grains and the mountains. Just like in the case of a har, it wasn't created or planted for the purpose of Avodah Zarah. I mean, the mountain lives in nature. Is af hai nami. This too, meaning the grains and the herbage, is lo netov b'tchilu lekach, and therefore, if it wasn't planted originally for that, it cannot be the Rabbanan who asked it. The chumrah here is that of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. Itmar. Avnei har shenidaldalu. There's going to be a great controversy of surrounding the status of parts of the stone of the mountain that were dislodged. Right? You remember when you go through, you drive through the mountains, it says, what does it say on the signs there? It says mountain, like it says deer crossing. Also, it says, something about the stones from the mountain that could fall, avalanche,
falling rocks or something.
Yeah. And that's why they build all these fences and so forth and so. But sometimes, they just want to warn you as a driver, you shouldn't get killed by a stone. So that stone is dislodged from the mountain. And there's machlokes b'nei Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yochanan. We don't know who says what, but later on the Gemara is going to try to figure that out. Chad over, according to one opinion, asuros, the stones are prohibited. V'chad omer mutaros. In other words, the mountain itself is mutter, even though it was worshipped. What about something that was dislodged from the mountain? It's no longer attached to the mountain. Does it still retain its original status as a mountain? My time demand mutaros kehar. In other words, that shita that was matir, the dislodged stones, was of the opinion that the stone still retains its connection to the mountain. And just like the mountain itself was not created by human intervention, it exists in nature, so too the falling of the stone, falling rocks zone, I think it says. Yeah, so that too was not created by human intervention, and therefore it's mutter. Right? Afhani, even these stones that got dislodged, they fell out from the mountain. Ein bem tzitzis yad adam mutar. Gemara says, wait a minute. That analogy is not a fair analogy. Ma har shekein mechubar. The har in its natural state is attached to the ground. We don't know of a har that was detached to the ground, from the ground. I mean, except for some miracles in Jewish history.
Right.
But the dislodged stones are not mountains. Okay, so now we get into a very complicated sugya. We'll try to do the best we can in the few minutes that we have. And the Gemara says, "Behema tochiach." Now, if an animal was worshipped, insofar as an animal is an animate object, meaning it has life and locution and movement, it's not like a mountain, it's mutter. The animal itself is mutter. We may see that there are certain harchakos that the Rabbanan said don't use it for carbon or whatever, but technically, according to the strict letter of the law, the animal is mutter. Now, what does that prove as far as our sugya is concerned? We're talking about something that's not attached to the ground. The animal is not attached to the ground. And yet, this is a precedent for the heter of Avodah Zarah, that it's permitted. An animal is permitted even though it was worshipped. It's relevant to India. And in that case, the case of a dislodged stone, what are you going to tell me? That it's not mechubar. Well, guess what? You want a precedent for something that's not mechubar l'karka, it's not attached to it's detached, and yet it's mutter. Okay, I'll give you the case of a behema. So why were you insisting in your logic that the har is mechubar, and therefore it's mutter? The dislodged stones are not mechubar, and therefore they're also. I'm going to give you a case of something that's dislodged in inverted commas, meaning it's not mechubar, and yet it's mutter. And therefore, we should have every right to say that the dislodged stones, despite the fact that they're not mechubar, they're not attached to the ground, nevertheless they are mutter. Or says, no, no, no. Well, what are you talking about? You're comparing an animal to a stone? We know that an animal was not prohibited because it's a living creature. You can't take a living creature and turn it into Avoda Zara. But what does that have to do with a stone? The stone either is also it's mutter after it was worshipped, depending upon whether or not it's mechubar or it's dislodged. And therefore, if it's dislodged, then I might say that now it's also because it's no longer mechubar. Gemara says, but how yochia? You want to introduce the element of hafkas, iser avodah zarah based on the fact that it's a living creature. I'll show you something that's not a living creature, and yet, nevertheless, it's mufka from the iser avodah zarah, and that's har. Says the Gemara of Chazar Adin. Chazar Adin means you have two possible malamdim. Each one has a pircha, but if we combine the forces together and join them together, then we have a tzad hashavah shebahem. Chazar Adin lo roizeh karoizeh, but atzad hashavah shebahem she'ein behem tfisas yad adam. Why is it that in both the cases of the mountain and the animal that were worshipped, there's no Isra Avodah Zarah? The answer is because there's no human element here. It's pure nature. It's the divine creation without any hand of a human being. Is therefore af kol sheyesh bo tfisas yad adam umuter. Kol she'ein bo tfisas yad, meaning the case of a stone that got dislodged and fell from the mountain is also a case where there was no human intervention, and therefore it's mutter. Gemara says, no, no, no. Mal etzad hashavah shebahen. If we look at the mountain and the animal, and we look at what's the lowest common denominator, shekein lo nishtanu mibriyasam. Here we're talking about the natural state in which they were created. So maybe when the Torah says that the Avodah Zarah, the worshiping, doesn't prohibit something which is part of nature and there was no human intervention, that's only because it's in its original state. But now you have a rock that fell out of the mountain. It's not in its original state, and therefore it's not part of the nature of which God created. That's mufka from Avodah Zarah. Ella says the Gemara, Asya mi behema balas mum uma veha. Let's take the case of an animal that was blemished. You're telling me that the reason why we're mafkia and permit the Avodah Zarah is because it was in its natural state. Well, what about an animal that's blemished? That's not in its natural state. It tripped and fell or swallowed a nail, and that's not the way it looks in nature. I mean, it was created shalom, tomim, and now it's blemished. So let's see and derive the conclusion that the element of is it in its natural state, lo nishtana mibriyosam, or is its original natural state changed, nishtana mibriyosam, is irrelevant. Inami, the Gemara has another possibility. Mi behema tama umi ilan yavish. We could create a tzad hashavah from an unblemished animal, a tamim, and an elan that dried up. It withered and withered away. So what do we have in these two cases? There's no tfisas yad ha'adam, right? The animal is in its natural state. The elan is not in its natural state, but it changed its state, not by virtue of human intervention, but in and of itself. It dried up. And the same thing should apply to a dislodged stone. Umandiyasa. So until now, we have done a great job in explaining that opinion that says that the dislodged stones, even though they were worshipped by Avodah Zara, are mutter. And that's going to be a derivative from one of two possible tzad hashavas shebahem. But in any event, the basic underlying principle is that it got dislodged naturally, but not through human intervention. Well, what about the other Mandir who says that these dislodged stones, if they were worshipped, are asur? Is lahachi ksiv? We have a ribui. Shakit shaksenu v'toiv tavenu. The Torah says you have to just, it's repulsive, get rid of everything that has any, any vestige of avodah zarah to it. Diafagav diasya midina lehetera. And even though, if we had the tzad hashava, we would come to the conclusion that it might be mutter, but the Torah adds shakit shaksenu to tell me that it's asur lo tasya. Don't derive any heterim from a tzad hashava. Now, interesting is that in tomorrow's daf, the Mishnah is going to derive from that same pasuk of Shakit Shaktsenu that Avodah Zara is mitame like a sheretz. Interesting. Initially, the issue of whether or not a stone that was dislodged from the mountain naturally is also if it was worshipped or not was a machlokus between the Bnei Reb Chia, but we didn't know who held what. Tistayim, I'm going to try to prove to you that the Bnei Reb Chia that the kula was the Bnei Reb Chia. And how do we know this? The boy Chizkiah. Now, we have to understand that Rabbi Chia had a number of sons, one of whom was called Chizkiah. And he came forward with this crazy case, again, I can't explain the psychology here, of somebody who worships an egg. And boy Chizkiah, he asked the question, Zokev or Zokaf Beisa Lishtachvos Lamahu. Somehow he stood up the egg in an upright position, maybe put it between two stones or something, and he starts bowing down to the egg, as if it's the king of the universe. And the question is, says Chizkiah, does this egg become prohibited? Because we might think, Lishtachavos la v'shtachvel, right? He stood up the egg for the purpose of bowing down to the egg, and he went ahead and he bowed down to it. He was good for his intention, for his original intention. V'kom mi boile, came Chizkiah and he asked the question, Haizaki fasa, ihavi maisa, ilavi maisa. How much significance should we attach to the fact that he stood up this egg for the purpose of bowing down to it? And it's not like he created the egg. It's not like he planted the tree that we spoke about before. Or, for example, if let's say some idol worshiper would deliberately dislodge, remove an even from the mountain, then there was yesh ba tfisas yad. What kind of tfisas yad is here? The fact that he stood up the egg? Ilovi ma'aser. Avolo zakaf, or should we say no? That maybe there's some significance to the fact that he set up the egg in an upright position for the purpose of bowing down to it, accepting it as his deity, and therefore there's a human element here. It's tfisas yad. Or should we say no? It's not asur lo mitzvah because setting up the egg is not in any way a profound action that creates the egg. Shma mino b'nei Reb Chia t'sharu. So from the fact that Reb Chia thought in general, if there was no original intention and Isur, because again, originally the stones were part of the mountain, then it's mutter. Then it makes sense that he would ask, well, what about the case of the egg where he stood it up? Is that considered a maisa or not? Lo, the Gemara rejects it. Maybe Bnei Reb Chia were the ones who said that the stones that got dislodged automatically from this as asur after they were bowed down to. Now, in the case of the egg, let's say this person would have bowed down to the egg even if the egg was rolling on its side and he hadn't set it up, zakuf meaning erect. No, so why was Chizkiah vacillating about the case where he stood it up. What's the case? He was asking, vacillating, what about a case where he stood it up for the purpose of, but he never followed through? Ulaman. There's one man who's going to say that once a Jew, chas v'shalom, prepares something for idolatry purposes, then it's also immediately, just by virtue of the fact that Hazmona Milsa, he designated it for that purpose, even though he never followed through. Asura. So the egg, therefore, would be prohibited by the fact that it was set up for the purpose of Avoda Zara, erect on its point. But Ilaman Diomar, if Chizkiah was saying that Ad Sheteovid, that when a Jew designates something for Avoda Zara, but he never follows through, it's not Asur, Holopalcha, then in this egg, he never worshipped it. So, no matter how you cut the egg, I guess you'd say, why does Chizkiah have any question about its status? Tzricha says, his original intention when he set up the egg upright was to worship it. But even though the Jew didn't bow down to it, I can't even imagine the scenario, but anyway, a guy came along and bowed down to it. And ki ha diyamar Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel Yisrael shezakav levena l'shtachvus v'ov d'kochav v'shtachav ela asura. Even though it was the Jew who stood up this brick, again, just like you stand up the egg upright to worship it, you stand up a brick upright in order to worship it, and then instead of the Jew worshiping it and following through, it was the guy who worshipped it. The coming boy lay levena who deminkaraz kifasavel beitzel devolushna. So what was Chizkiah? With this will end. What was he vacillating about? He didn't know whether to compare the case of setting up the egg upright to it should be analogous to the case of setting up a brick upright. Because in the case of, there's another element in the equation called heker, nikar. In the case of setting up a brick this way, apparently it's very discernible. Anybody could see it and understand that this is on the way to becoming Avodah Zara. Again, in their society. But in the case of an egg, it's not so apparent. A brick's length is considerably greater than its width. So when a brick is stood up, it appears elevated. Okay, that's elevation, as we said before, when we spoke about that heap, is indicative of a deity.
Right.
But what about the case of setting up an egg? That's not so noticeable. Nobody would realize that he's doing it in order to give it, a great deal of honor and demonstrate, that it should be treated as a deity, as an idol. And the final conclusion of this Gemara is teku. So the Gemara doesn't come to any conclusion about the case of the egg that was set up upright and was not worshipped later on. Okay, then. Thank you so much. All right. Call to. Bye-bye.
Call to.